So morning everyone. Welcome to our second Controller Innovate webinar, which is really all about, as mentioned last time we were on it, kind of providing kind of tips and tricks, added value, a bit of education around the kind of tools and technology that you guys are using. So this session today is going to be focusing on setting up your IT environment for external collaborations, and that's setting up to work with third parties, suppliers, partners, new acquired businesses, etc. So Heiko is going to talk through that in a bit more detail. If you go to the next slide. As always, a little bit of housekeeping. As you probably noticed, your microphones are muted and your cameras are off. That's purely just to kind of keep the session flowing correctly, but we absolutely encourage interaction and questions. There is a Q&A, but there's also the chat. So we keep an eye on both. But if you've got any questions throughout, please put on there. We'll monitor. If it feels right, we'll jump in and ask that there and then. If not, we've allocated some time at the end of the session to go through in a bit more detail and answer any questions. And if we don't answer it, then we'll make sure we get back to you. And finally, the slides will, of course, be shared around afterwards if you do want to refer back to. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Heiko, who's going to talk through today.
Thanks very much, David. So good morning, everyone. Let's talk about modern collaboration, shall we? So as you probably realize nowadays, everybody's a lot more interconnected with one another. We're working very closely together, but there are some complexities and difficulties that people still struggle with to this day. We may find that people are making use of different tools and technologies to work with one another. You may have requirements where you need to share files with customers internally, externally. You may need to bring suppliers on board. We've seen in the field that some customers go to extreme lengths in order to maintain their security stance and their policies. They may go down the route of deploying brand new devices and shipping them out to contractors on a short notice for a temporary period of time, or even a longer period of time. But either way, it results in a lot of effort and material in order just to give somebody access to data in your environment. So let's talk about how we're typically collaborating. The main four culprits here are going to be emails, VPN access, remote desktop services, and FTP. In each of these cases, there are pros and cons to each ones. They have their use cases, but at the same time, they do have their drawbacks with one another. In terms of your access to your suppliers and your customers, ultimately, at the end of the day, your data is at the heart of it. You want to keep your data secure, you want to keep your data intact, and you want to stop your data walking away from one environment to another environment. It's all very fine and well that you have a conversation with somebody via email, and then you end up having to go and chase down those emails to try and find out what it is that they were saying, what particular version of the document they were working on. Or ultimately, the reality is that in some cases you work with a contractor or supplier and they walk off with some of your corporate data, be it maliciously or be it by accident. And as IT administrators, we want to really keep that locked down as much as possible. So let's talk a little bit more some of the other pains and headaches. Ultimately, at the end of the day, with modern collaboration approaches, we want to make things as simple as possible for IT and as secure as possible for the rest of the business. So emails, really great and handy for collaboration, but you end up with confusing email chains. You're going to end up with 2, 3, 4, 5 different versions of the same document, and just slows down information updates because you have to wait for somebody to send you an email, send them the reply, go make amendments, and so forth and so forth. VPNs as well. We're not particularly fans of VPNs here, fundamentally down to the fact that if you put a VPN connection in place, I don't care how great your firewall is, it is still opening up a point of an attack surface in your environment, and you have to not worry just about the devices connecting, but everything else on the other side of that VPN and everything else on the other side of that firewall. So that creates a lot of additional headache. And just from an end user experience, if we're talking about later on shared drafts and file shares, it's really a pain in the neck when it comes to traveling and having to work, going on the train, the bus, the plane, whatever. It's not ideal for every use case. Remote desktops. These have come a long way. Remote desktop solutions are really good and convenient nowadays, but it still is a bit of effort to set up just to allow somebody to collaborate with you on a short period. While it is a lot more secure, you do keep your data in your environment, you are now having to go down the route of setting up a managed identity for that user, assigning licenses to that user, and then having the overhead in your remote desktop environment for that user. FTP, well, secure FTP, it's great for dumping information across, but it's not a useful tool for collaboration in any way, shape, or form. Typically, you'd use that if you have to upload sensitive data that's going to be available from now until whenever your engagement ends with your contract or with your contracted party. But at the same time, it's very time consuming, a lot of manual work to upload and download it. And finally, shared drives, the good old approach that everybody is quite familiar with. Again, as I mentioned with VPN access, shared drives, they had their place. I don't think that they have a place in the industry that much anymore. It still limits your users' mobility. It's great for doing things like folder redirection, but if you're trying to collaborate with external parties, well, you now have to go down the approach of using multiple methods, using a VPN and a remote desktop, and then giving them the shared access. So it's a lot of architectural overhead and infrastructure overhead just to provide the capability for people to collaborate with one another. Let's look at our main collaboration options that we're gonna talk about. So primarily nowadays, you've got the access to Microsoft 365. People are chatting with each other in teams. They're doing it directly to each other. They're creating team groups or and unfortunately the naming is horrendous, but teams of teams, and in those teams they're creating chats or channels in order for them to chat and collaborate with one another. Well, a lot of people also overlook the fact is you can drop files and files in there, Word documents, Excel documents, PowerPoints. It allows you to collaborate directly with each other. Very similar to, if anybody remembers Google Docs back in the day, that you could look and see, oh, wow, I can see exactly where he is on the document. Well, if you have your content in SharePoint and in Teams and in OneDrive, you've got that same level of functionality as well for your internal collaboration. Your Microsoft documents as well, for the most part, those can be collaborated and they support it. You may have other file types like PDFs that you're uploading into SharePoint, into OneDrive, into Teams. It's quite fundamentally from Microsoft 365 stack, the combination of SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. It's really good for general non-technical collaboration where it's really easy just to give a person a file, a picture, a PDF or whatever, and let them view it, let them edit it, and be able to have that single source of truth instead of creating multiple copies of the same file. For a more technical side of things, when we're having to do collaboration with people, with developers log into your servers, into your databases, you start looking at tools and functions like Azure Bastion. Now, instead of deploying a remote desktop service and say, okay, you can log on to my VPN and then go onto my remote desktop, and then finally from there, you can access my environment. You've got the option now to set up Azure Bastion that allows them direct access into a Windows or Linux machine. It can be a machine in Azure, and it actually nowadays it does support remote desktop access and SSH access into your servers on-premise as well, if you still have any, which you probably should. But beyond that, the beauty behind that is it integrates with Entra ID, along with everything else on the list here, and that is your identity, and that is where your organization is able to set policies in place to secure the access, to enforce things like multi-factor authentication. And this is where you can force your external parties and your internal staff to have to comply with these policies, regardless of how technical or non-technical they are. From the Azure DevOps side of things, the collaboration efforts there are relatively easy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that further on. But if you're doing development with code, historically, people made use of things like GitHub, and nowadays Azure DevOps has been used more and more for that collaboration to be able to work together internally and externally. And another area for consideration, and this is a bit of the black sheep in the group, but Azure Virtual Desktops, instead of having to spin up massively complex environments, you can relatively quickly spin up a AVD instance or an Azure Virtual Desktop on its own, or part of a pool for those external parties. And similar to deploying any other virtual machine, you can limit that network connectivity to lock it down. And that covers it all for your technical audience for the most part. So, as I mentioned, a moment ago, Entra ID, formerly as your Active Directory, that is your identity. So the perimeter isn't, the security perimeter isn't anymore the network. Your security perimeter now is your identity layer. The network's still there as well, but the identity comes first and foremost. So in your environment, you have your email address, you have your Entra ID, you're going to sign in with that, you can authenticate with that. You may have a separate one for your technical environment, which is really good practice to follow. And you're going to use that identity to access things like your OneDrive, your Teams, and your SharePoint. And again, your policies will be applied to Entra ID for all those sign-ins. Now, let's have a look quickly at a short video as to how you want to go about sharing with somebody outside your organization, what that typically looks like. If I can bring up my cursor. So this experience is now quite ubiquitous for personal Microsoft 365 accounts and for corporate accounts. You can just go into SharePoint or into OneDrive, click on the share icon, and you've got the option to share it with anyone or just with specific people externally. This is quite a wide open approach, but in this example, you can just type in the email address of that user, and that's going to generate a unique link that gets emailed to that user's mailbox. They're going to receive that email, they're going to be able to open it, and they're going to be able to sign in with their identity. So this is still two organizations that are separate from one another, but allows you a level of collaboration with one another without bringing a new identity into your environment and keeping your data in your environment, in your estate. So let's have a look at this. So as we mentioned before, you've got your options for SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive, and your Entra ID for doing your internal collaboration. Whoever it is that you're working with, they're going to have their own Microsoft ID, their own Entra ID or Azure Active Directory, and they're going to have their own SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive. And ideally, what we want to do is we want to be able to work in their environment like they're working in our environment, and vice versa. So this is where we start talking about things like guest invites and business-to-business relationships. This is basically two approaches that you can take to collaborate with external parties. There are different use cases for each one. They can both be used, but if I were to summarize, guest invites are for those one-off collaborations with a small subset of users. You're talking maybe 4 or 5 users with a partner, a contractor you're working with, or a support agent from another organization that you're working with. You may want to just send them an email, a guest invite via email on a one-off case, and assign the permissions to them accordingly. The business-to-business relationship, that is where you are working with a large organization where users may come and go, and there may be 10, 20, 30, or 100 users that you're collaborating with. So that B2B relationship really does help to make it a lot easier to work with those other organizations. And we'll drill into each one of these a bit more. Now let's talk about guests. So fundamentally, and conceptually, what is a guest identity? Is it creating a new identity, or am I creating a new account? No, not at all. The guest identity, for all intents and purposes, it is you have company A, you have company B. You work in company A. Whoever it is that you're collaborating with works in company B. You have data in company A that you want the external party to access. You're going to send them their guest invite, a guest invite to them to company B, and that user will be able to use their identity, their email, to log on and access your organization's data that you have allowed them access to. And if you have policies in place requiring multi-factor authentication or any other additional controls, that's going to be enforced on them as well as their own policies. Why do we want to do it? Well, we don't want to have to worry about managing somebody's identity. You don't want to set up a managed identity for someone you're collaborating with and then have to worry about, oh, what do we do if they leave their organization? With a guest invite, you don't worry about that. If the account gets disabled in company B, they're going to get automatically disabled in company B, and they're no longer going to be able to sign into your environment. I'm sure there's probably loads of people here who've had the experience where they've had 10, 20, 30 users in a list with varying levels of access, and you've sat there and scratched your head and gone, who the hell are all these people? Where did they get access from? This person hasn't logged on since 2017. Why is this account still here? Well, This is why we want to use the guest access for the external party, so we just avoid that scenario completely. So let's have a look at a couple of options for collaboration. So again, guest sharing will be via B2B or guest invites. For your organization, if you're doing guest invites, you can invite them to Microsoft Teams. You can give them shares through various links. You can invite them to private channels on Teams. And that really is then having them in a Teams channel in your organization. They can view some accounts in your directory, and there's a feature called Access Reviews, which is essentially setting up a automated process to identify who's the owner of a security group and what level of access is required for that security group. So this is now taking that level of management away from the IT team and putting it in the hands of the managers that are running those teams, running those departments. And the way that is perceived is they will get an email. That email will say, you have this member group, this is the name of the group, you are the owner of the group, and here's your list of users. Please select which users still need access into this group. If, for some other reason, that person doesn't see that email and they don't reply to it within a few days, you can set up a chain that goes on to the next level of priority, and then the next, until eventually it comes to somebody who will make the decision as to who needs to be in that group and who doesn't need to be in that group. Now, on the far right-hand side, you can see there's a couple of no's and yeses. So there's a little bit of an overlap between the two. The far right-hand side is more your business-to-business connections, where they're not going to get access to Teams directly, but you can still collaborate with them via a shared Microsoft Teams channel. Reasoning there is the way these two, the way Teams, general Teams access and shared channels in Teams, the way they behave with one another is they're slightly different, for different purposes. For the Teams access, you just want to get them into your Teams, keep all the data there, and you can do that with 1 or 2 people. But the shared channel access, that is where you're going to want a lot of people to be able to come into your Microsoft Teams environment. The permissions through file sharing links, the permissions are not applied via B2B relationships, but they would be applied to the guest account. So again, there's a little bit of an overlap there with those two. And as we mentioned, shared channels aren't going to be used for guest access, but they are going to be used for the direct connect for the B2B. Now let's move on. By the way, if there are any questions, by all means, please post them in the chat, raise your hand. We'll be able to stop every now and then and look at some questions, or if we can't, we'll get to them at the end of the session. So let's talk about collaborating with guests in SharePoint sites specifically. So there's a couple of prerequisite steps that you need to set up in order to allow external users to come into SharePoint. We're going to start off by going through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And from here, we're going to go down to our identity management, which is Entra ID or Azure Active Directory. You can access this via Microsoft 365, or you can access this via Azure. It's the same thing at the end of the day. From Entra ID, we're going to go to our external identities, and we're going to navigate down to our external collaboration settings. Now, there's a lot of different settings here, but if we walk through these settings very briefly, the guest user access restrictions as a starter, that is going to be limiting where users can access, which users in your environment have the permission to, which level of permission those external users have to your organization. So starting at the top here, the guest user access restriction, we can allow them to see everything in our domain. And this is in our Active Directory domain. This is our Azure Active Directory domain, just to make things a bit more confusing. But we can allow them to have access to everything. Now, that's not ideal. Preferably what we want to do is limit what they can access, because we don't want them to have carte blanche into our environment. Once we've selected that, we're going to want to move on and configure who in our organization can invite people. We can allow anyone and everyone to invite people. There are layers of protections you can put in place, but typically what we're going to want to do is define which members of the organization can invite guest users, and you want to define what that process is going to look like. Now, coming down a little bit further, our collaboration restrictions, we can either allow anyone, we can either allow any domain to be invited or user from any domain to be invited. And when I say domain, I'm talking about the part after the @ in their email address. So if you're collaborating with loads of different people, then great, keep it there. Allow anyone to be invited, but limit who can invite your organization. But if you're working with very few select companies at a time, then you may want to look down the approach of allowing only specified domains, but then allowing a bit more flexibility as to who can send those invites, because these are going to be organizations that you trust a bit more. And that you're not going to be too concerned about that. So it's a bit of a balancing act you have to decide on with this. Fundamentally, when you go down, you select specific domains. All your admin has to do then is go ahead and input the name of the domains that are going to be allowed to collaborate with your organization. Moving on. Now that we've set up the groundwork on Entra ID, the next step we have to take is configuring our organization settings and our organization policies. Now, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, all of this runs off Microsoft 365 groups. So we need to go into Microsoft 365 groups and ensure that is enabled, that guest members can access group content. Both these sticks need to be enabled. If you don't have those enabled, then your guest users are going to struggle. They're not going to be able to access things on Teams, and it's just going to be a general headache, and you're going to sit there scratching your head wondering, why is this not working? And as Microsoft does, everything is on different websites. So now we have to go to a third portal, and this is going to be your SharePoint admin console. Now from our SharePoint admin console, we're going to define our SharePoint policies, and we're going to be looking to define, if this moves on, we want to define what those external users can do. Now, preferably, I would recommend you go down the route of new and existing guests must sign in to your organization, and then from there we want to look at allowing or defining what our default policy is for all our staff as to which options they're allowed to use when sharing links. Typically, only people within the organizations use. That's a strong approach to take, but that is going to make it really difficult to collaborate with people externally. So for that purpose, I would specify you want your default to be specific people can access the content in that link, because at that point you're going to email that link across. That's going to go through to 1, 2, or 3 individuals on the other side in that external organization, and those 3 members can access it. Now, apologies for that, my headset seemed to have cut off momentarily. Now that we've defined these, and now that we've essentially laid the groundwork, the next step you're going to need to take is to enable your SharePoint sites or define SharePoint sites what level of permissions they're allowed to have with external users. So similar to that tab that we selected earlier, you can go down to individual SharePoint sites and you can say either anyone can do external sharing from that SharePoint site, or you want to limit it down to new and existing guests, or if it's really critical information, you want to keep it internally, you can lock it down that it can't be shared. So that's an approach you can also take to just limit the scope of who can and can't access your data. So let's just recap quickly. We started off, we went into Entra ID. We enabled the external guest access. We recommended that you want to allow people to access from specific domains. We also wanted to enable the guest access via M365 groups. We defined our restrictions as to what guest users can and can't do, and who can and can't send invitations for those external users. We do want to define that new and existing guests who sign in are allowed to access our files, access our links, access our SharePoint. And then finally, we want to enable individual SharePoint sites to have access. Now, let's talk about guest access in Microsoft Teams. Now, I'm going to skip through this video because it is pretty much the same across the board. As you can see, we have to, again, do that prerequisite to make sure that the external collaboration is enabled. And again, we have to make sure the M365 groups is available as well. These are just the prerequisites for SharePoint and for Teams. And again, from the SharePoint Admin Center, we again want to define our policies. And just to be clear, we don't have to do this each and every single time. This is just differentiating between sites, sharing with sites and sharing with Microsoft Teams. Now that we've done that and we have that groundwork enabled, there's one more step you have to do. You have to go into the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, go to Guest Access, and very simply just turn on the Guest Access to allow those external users to come into your organization. So just recapping through that then, it's all the same as we just discussed a moment ago, but the main difference is this time around, we want to enable that Teams Guest Access here for Microsoft Teams. And as you may or may not know, Microsoft Teams is just the pretty face of Microsoft SharePoint. So let's talk about shared channels. So we've enabled our guest users to come into Microsoft Teams, but we want to also have shared channels where they can collaborate with us. This is not playing ball. So from our Teams Admin Center, we're going to go down to our Microsoft Team policies. And from here in the policies, we want to define what users can and can't do across the organization. We want to enable or disable if we're allowing users to create channels. As a recommendation, you do want to limit the availability for users to create and remove Microsoft Teams channels and Teams groups or team pages. Fundamentally, if you have it wide open, you run into a very similar problem that you have with Microsoft SharePoint. You're going to have too much sprawl, too much random information. It's too dispersed, and staff are going to stop using it properly. You're going to lose control there. So you do have the option here to enable it across the organization. What you may also want to do is consider turning these on and off for particular users for your organization. Again, just to limit the scope of access that people have. Now, if I direct your attention here, so again, you have the ability to assign it to particular users or particular security groups. I would highly recommend using security groups as much as possible. And then finally, are they allowed to create channels, yes or no? So let's move on. And I am going to, here we go. So we're going to go down, and in the team settings, we're literally just going to go down all the way to the bottom, and we're going to go down to shared channels. Now, it may not be entirely clear to your staff as to who they have to ask to get a shared channel created. What we want to do here is under the team settings, we want to go all the way down to the bottom here, find the shared channels, and provide a link to the request page. And this can just be a link to a Word document or to a SharePoint page in your organization on what the process is and who has to be emailed and asked in order for that to be set up. It does take a little bit of time to be set up, as mentioned there, but once that is done, we are able to move on. In terms of moving on then, again, coming to, as I mentioned a moment ago, about allowing specific domains, we want to define who can and can't access Microsoft Teams. We can either allow all external domains, and we control it via Entra ID as to which domains can be invited, or we can break this down again to that specific list of particular domains that we want to work with, that we want to collaborate with. Let's move on here. Now, we're going to go back to Entra ID. This is going to be a little bit different. It's not the same. This is where we're going to start setting up B2B direct connects. So we're going to go down to cross-tenant access settings and to organizational settings. And this is where you start adding and defining the organizations. You're going to need the tenant ID or the domain name from the external party you're working with. Their admins can provide you this tenant ID. It would be better to use the tenant ID rather than a name. And once you've enabled that, you can see that gets added, and we're going to want to configure the inbound access rules and the outbound access rules. Don't leave it at default. You want to step in this because by default, they will be blocked. We're going to go up to B2B Direct Connect. And from B2B Direct Connect, we're going to want to customize the settings, and we're just going to want to allow the access. Again, you have that level of control. You can define specific users and groups, but we're just going to allow all the users and groups to be able to access across the B2B. Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, with B2B, it's about collaboration for a large number of users. But you may take the approach of allowing specific security groups to access it. And you're going to want to do this for the external users and the external users and groups and applications. Specifically with applications, you want to define Office 365. If you haven't defined this, they are going to have to rely on purely on shared access. The identity for Office 365 is going to be the application ID may differ in your environment, but once we've done that, we're going to repeat the same what we've done in inbound access, in outbound access, and again, go up to B2B Direct Connect, and just go down to our customized settings and allow the access, and again, limit it down to particular users and groups. And once more, Office 365. So that's now allowing the flow of authentication from their organization into your organization and vice versa. You will need to collaborate with their admins and get them to do the same on their side as well if you want to access content in their environment as well. So let's recap on shared channels. I mean, at that point, then it's the same process with Microsoft Teams. You can go ahead and just create a Teams channel as a shared channel and then invite users from that organization or from that domain. So again, we're going to define our team policies and we can break it down to specific users and groups. We want to go with specific groups. We want to set up that link for what the process is to follow in Microsoft Teams. We're trying to set up shared channels. We're going to want to enable that external access with the external domains and define the particular domains, or just allow all the external domains. Because if you remember, we can define the external domains in Entra ID, and we can define the external domains that we're going to work with in Microsoft Teams when the Teams Admin Center. And then finally, we want to set up the B2B Direct Connect. Let's take a moment now and talk about a couple of scenarios. Where would we want to make use of this? Where do we want to, what tools do we want to use for different scenarios? So let's say you got a cross-company project management. You have a centralized project management team. They're working with multiple users, multiple groups across a wider organization. You're going to want to make use of Microsoft Teams, Microsoft SharePoint, Microsoft OneDrive. You can do this with the guest. You can do this with guest access, or you can do this with the B2B Direct Connect that we've just mentioned. Maybe you have a global sales team that's collaborating with one another. Well, in that case, you may want to consider inviting the user from the other domain, or potentially create a managed identity for them, but we want to avoid that as much as possible. And then again, collaborate together with them using Teams and SharePoint. Consider Azure Virtual Desktop as well. The reason we have Entra ID flagged in here, again, AVD is the black sheep. You can't do external guest access with Azure Virtual Desktop. You have to create a managed identity in order to allow the user to access the desktop initially. After that, you can then start using Microsoft Teams and SharePoint again going forward. If you want to if you're working with a consulting service and they're working with you to deliver something, Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive, those are great tools for collaborating with documents, project plans, change request documents, and then Azure Bastion, making use of that to access the virtual machine remotely. Or if you're working with somebody who's doing software development work for you, well, you can use Teams and SharePoint again or you can make use of Azure DevOps to allow them that external access. But again, with the DevOps piece, you want to consider setting up that B2B Direct Connect. Remote employee onboarding, if you're going to be using AVD, you need to set up that dedicated identity for them to access Azure Virtual Desktop. But from that point, they can work with you via Teams and OneDrive. And again, any files and folders that are on Teams, they appear in OneDrive. What some people may not be aware of, though, again, on the fact that SharePoint is Teams is the pretty face to SharePoint, you can create a SharePoint page that has a Teams Teams associated with it. So as content gets shared into Teams, it gets stored in SharePoint itself. And then finally, if you're doing a joint venture between two different companies, again, like collaboration with teams at SharePoint, the business relationship is a good consideration. But finally, private link is also another consideration point, and we'll get into private link in a little bit. So we've spoken now about the Microsoft 365 tools for collaborating with other organizations. Let's talk about some of the other tools that rely on your Entra identity. You got the ability to make use of Azure Bastion, Azure DevOps, Azure Virtual Desktops, and then Azure Private Link. Azure Bastion is going to allow you access into another organization's virtual machines without having to deploy a dedicated machine. They don't have to have any weird or wonderful resources in place. It's a very quick, direct tool for people to connect without needing to rely on a VPN. Azure DevOps, that's again a repository where information is stored, where scripts, where people can work on code and do coding reviews and do versioning control on those on their code between two organizations. You can invite the external users and keep your code in your organization. The Azure Virtual Desktops, that's your VDI option. I think everybody here may be familiar with RDS already, but the main benefit here is you don't have to worry about additional licensing. And then coming to the Azure Private Link, that is going to allow you to provide a private IP address in another organization's Azure tenant that links to a database or a storage account or another resource without the need for a VPN connection. But with that being said, let's talk about Bastion. So Bastion's going to give you the ability to provide secure RDP and SSH access to virtual machines directly via the Azure portal. So you don't need to set up a VPN access. You don't need to set up any weird, wonderful tools. They can authenticate via the Entra ID. They log on with multi-factor authentication. They're going to hit the Azure portal, and they're going to use Azure Bastion to allow them to directly connect to the virtual machine. This essentially replaces the need for a jump box in your environment. And with Azure Bastion, you can use access control, role-based access to limit what the users can and can't see in your environment, so you can control what virtual machines they can access. The other bit that's nice about this is it's not a tool that just applies for Microsoft Azure. You can use this to access your on-premise servers as well. So it's not just purely RDP and SSH for Azure. It also will allow you to route it down to your Active Directory servers on site or any other legacy servers or services that may exist on site or in a different data center without needing to rely on the virtual machines being in Azure or being onboarded with something like Azure Arc. So if we take a moment here and have a look at this, and this is going to show you what it looks like for a user or for a consultant to sign into a virtual machine. They're going to find the virtual machine, and in the top left corner there is the icon for connecting to that virtual machine, which is up here. Now, as I mentioned, you can limit what the users can and can't see. So if this user can only see this virtual machine, this is all they'll see. They're going to go down to Bastion, and they're going to say, I want to make use of Bastion. You do have to have permission in place for them to see the virtual machine and the Bastion instance. But from there, a Bastion will have a particular address space. If it's not in place, you can set up Bastion very quickly and just define what subnet and IP address range needs to be used with Bastion. This is a great tool. It's something that takes 5 to 10 minutes to set up, very little overhead and headache, and you're talking about very minimal costs for running this in Azure. Realistically, you're talking about 50 to 80 pounds a month for the standard tier. The basic tier isn't free, but it is still a relatively cheap and affordable tier of access. This is now still walking through the process of setting it up. So you can define how many instances, what tier you want to make use of, keep the instance count down to 2 unless you have loads of users making use of it, and you will need a public IP address to use Azure Bastion. Once you start off that process and create Azure Bastion, the deployment goes relatively quickly. You're talking about 10 minutes tops for that to be deployed. And then finally, once that's done, The user will be able to connect in the same way, and they'll be prompted for a username and password, and that will be the username and password that you would use for that virtual machine, be it a local username and password, be it a domain join username and password. And if you've gone above and beyond and you have onboarded your virtual machine into Azure Active Directory and use that for your identity, you'll be able to sign in with your Entra ID for that virtual machine as well. But I think most cases we're just going to use a username and password. And once we type that in, it's going to open up a new web portal. This is all over port 443. And within the browser now, you can see we have access to that virtual machine and we're signed in and we can start working. Let's talk about Azure DevOps briefly. Nice thing with Azure DevOps is it works on a tiering scale of 1 to 5. For every 1 licensed user you have, you can invite 5 guest users. I say tiering, I mean ratio. It is still going to rely on your Azure Active Directory, and it's going to enforce your Entra ID policies. The management for inviting guests is very similar to Entra ID's method for inviting guests. You are simply going to need to enable the user policy that external access for those users in your DevOps instance is allowed. Once that's done, all you're going to do is go down to your list of users and you're going to select add a user, and you just provide the email address for the external user you want to add, and that user gets an email saying you've been invited to Azure DevOps, click to join now, and you have the URL for your organization that they can then follow and sign in with their existing identity. Azure Virtual Desktop, if you're not familiar with AVD, this is a quick shout out for the technology, but fundamentally, you don't need to worry about massive amounts of licenses or infrastructure, web access gateways, broker services, diagnostic services, databases, and. All you need to worry about is the virtual machine that you're going to be hosting on, the apps the user is going to make use of, and the Active Directory instance that they're going to sign in with. Highly recommend making use of FS Logics as a standard across the board for those instances. You can deploy the machine, have that configured to power on and off as and when the user connects to the machine. That's going to save you a fair bit of money every single month, so you don't have the machine running and waiting. The nice thing as well is you can go and deploy that virtual machine in another host group, in another network, so you can isolate those external users from the rest of your environment. Again, reiterating the point that it is the black sheep, and that in order for them to access Azure Active, in order for them to access those desktops, you do have to create a managed identity for them. So that managed identity being you have to go and create a username and password for that user. But once that's done, they can access it from a laptop, from their tablet, or from their mobile phone, wherever they want. They just have to hit the URL and they're within your environment. Azure Private Link. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this. I highly recommend that you take this away as homework for additional reading. But for all intents and purposes, the way Private Links works is you have your resources here on the left-hand side. You are going to point your virtual machines and your gateway at an Azure Private Link. That's going to go across the Microsoft backbone, and you're going to provide those credentials to whoever it is that you're working with, or you may receive it from your supplier. And that is going to allow you access into a storage account, a database, maybe a data lake instead, or something else on the marketplace. It essentially removes that need for a VPN connection, for having to deploy resources in the same subscription and putting weird, wonderful access controls in place. But it really just simplifies the collaboration between those two organizations. You can get it down to a single IP address. You don't have to worry about weird or wonderful routing rules in order to work with them. Just to bring some closing points, if you're not sure how to invite a user using a guest invite, simply go into your Entra ID, go down to your users, select new user, and go to invite external user. At that point, you just type in the email address of that user. That sends an email notification off to the user, and they will get the prompt to log on and sign into your organization, and if need be, set up MFA in order to access your organization. You can do it via individual users. You can do it via bulk emails from Excel spreadsheets. I will say that setting up the B2B, the initial setup is harder, but once B2B is set up and you're managing it via group membership, it's a lot easier and a lot less overhead than doing the guest invites. If you're not familiar with conditional access, fundamentally that is your rules and policies that you put in place in Entra ID to enforce things like multi-factor authentication, taking the approach as to what regions people can sign in from, and also being able to control what apps that users can access. You want to make sure with your policy, your conditional access policies, that you have guests and external users selected. You can achieve this by selecting all users as well, but I think, as we all know, exclusions exist and exclusions will continue to exist. So for all intents and purposes, we are always going to be stuck going down the route of selecting all users and defining those users in groups, even if it ends up being all users being in a separate AD group. As a small reminder, nested groups are not supported with Entra ID, so do not try and be clever and have 2 or 3 nested groups in your conditional access policies. It will break. And as a closing point on your conditional access policies, if you're not sure how it's going to work, there's always the what if button, and you can select a couple of users and run that query to see what is going to happen if you apply those policies to that user. Are they going to be able to sign in, or are they going to get blocked, or are they going to get asked for MFA access? So closing out, let's just have a very brief recap. The user contractor is in an external identity. He is in an external domain. We can either invite him using guest access, or we can establish a B2B relationship with his organization's Entra ID domain. And from that point, we're going to be able to invite him into Azure DevOps. He can connect to the virtual machines using our standard RBAC access, or he can collaborate with us using Teams and SharePoint, and those then enable the collaboration with Microsoft Words, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., etc. On that point, then, I think it is now time for the Q&A session.
There was one question in there already, Heiko. I don't know if you've seen it in the Q&A. It says, with guests, if a file is shared via OneDrive, e.g. right-click and share, they won't be in a group. How do you then periodically access reviews?
Okay, so access reviews applies purely down to groups or group memberships. If you're talking about limiting that access for those users, I think if we go back to one of the earlier slides, there is something that I have completely skipped over, but will help with that. What you can do is take the approach by setting a default on your shared links that they will expire after a period of time. I might not actually have that on this video. Yeah, here we go. Here we go. So as you can see on screen, choose expiration permissions options for anyone links. Now, again, this is applying just purely for the anyone links, but you can set how many days until those links expire automatically. So that is how you would manage the control and the access with that. So maybe take an approach of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 180 days, whatever. Just keep in mind that if somebody just shares something out, it will expire after a period of time. The user just has to go and reshare that again.
Does that go?
Hopefully that answered Jeremy's question.
No other questions in the Q&A. I can't see any in the chat. Yeah, give another minute if people want to put any questions now, or raise their hand and want to come off camera. If not, we'll conclude today's webinar.
I think in the meantime, it is worth making mention, there is always the question that comes up about licensing. How does licensing work? I've got an E3 license, I've got business premium licenses. Do those external users have to have licenses applied to them? It varies in case to case, but for the most part, it is assumed that those users are bringing in their own licenses into your environment. So they will. Let's take Microsoft Word as an example. They can access Word on the web app, but they want to use Word on their desktop. If they want to make use of Word on their desktop, they can utilize their own Microsoft Word license. If they don't have access to a Microsoft Word license, Microsoft works again on that ratio of 1 to 5 that they could open up Microsoft Word. But if you're collaborating with those users, they most likely, and they have zero licenses whatsoever, they're most likely going to be end up having to use and rely on the web portal version of Microsoft Word, but they can also make use of the version of Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint on a mobile device such as a tablet as well. It gives them a semi-desktop experience.
Cool. I think we'll leave it there then.
All right.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Hope you found that useful. If you got any questions, I'll be sending out the slides after this and the recording, so obviously you can reach out to me direct and I can point in the direction of Heiko or anyone else who would be useful.